Here, read this.
Woof.
So, as you may or may not know, over at John Kay's bookshop, we have released our own version of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for which I've written an introduction that goes into the Edinburgh connections to Stevenson's novel. That's kind of the idea of our imprint, John Kay Press, to republish classics that have some relation to Edinburgh. Some of the ones we've got planned have very direct and obvious influences. That Stevenson was born in Edinburgh, and there's been a long-standing critical argument that despite the novel being set in London, it's sort of Edinburgh in disguise. That's the opinion of people like G.K. Chesterton and Maury McLaren, and I go into that in detail in my introduction. Some of the other titles we've got planned have more tenuous connections to the city, but more about those some other time. In terms of what my introduction goes into, it's not just Stevenson's time in the city, but also the Edinburgh personalities that may have influenced the creation of Jekyll and Hyde. Specifically the dual personalities like Deacon Brodie, a poisoner that Stevenson knew personally, who led an outwardly placid and amiable life, but was secretly a psychopath. And then there is the split personality of Edinburgh itself, delineated into Old Town and New Town. The whole city, Stevenson writes in Edinburgh Picturesque Notes, leads a double existence. Now, the reason I'm talking about this now is that on some recent podcast interviews I've been doing on the subject of Robert Ferguson, we've been talking quite a bit about the construction of the new town, which began midway through the 18th century. A great northern exodus across the drained Nor Loch, which became Princes Street Gardens, the construction of the big bridges that span the old town and the new town, the windiest part of the city, as Stevenson was later to write, and the building of Newtown's Georgian blocks with their neoclassical airs, starting at Princes Street and then making their way slowly down towards the sea. In talking about this again, it reminded me of something I didn't end up putting in my introduction. And this was a riff on an image that Nabokov uses in his lectures on literature. He has a fantastic chapter on Jekyll and Hyde. And in describing the composite makeup of Jekyll/Hyde, he uses a series of diagrams. There is a circle denoting the good side, Jekyll, and a slightly smaller circle denoting Hyde. And he shows how these are superimposed upon one another, how within what he calls the pleasantly tweedy design of Jekyll, you can see the scattered rudiments of evil. And what Jekyll affects through his magical serum is a separation of these two, which eventually leads to him, the good side of Jekyll, floating above Hyde like a kind of smoke ring, Nabokov says, as if this black concentrated evil had fallen out of the remaining ring of good, but this ring of good still remains. Hyde still wants to change back into Jekyll. So what I was going to do is compare these illustrations that Nabokov makes to maps of the development of Edinburgh's new town, starting with the black yoke of the old and then steadily building up that tweedy exterior of the new. I was going to use this to suggest that it is really Jekyll who is the construct, not Hyde. Hyde is the original hairy id over whom the socially acceptable Henry, Jekyll, has been woven. This makes Hyde a rather ironic name, as it is really the doctor who would be the outer skin. Now, I was going to back this up by going to Stevenson's Picturesque Notes, which I do quote in the introduction. He even says of the old town that it has a strange physiognomy, which sounds extremely Hyde-like, and notices that it has not only centrality in Edinburgh, but a physical dominance on its throne of crags, the warlike shadow of the castle glowering down over the newly built new town, whose drafty parallelograms, as Stevenson calls them, sound like the kind of flimsy sort of stuff that can be easily overthrown perhaps by certain agents, such as those that Jekyll discovers, and speaks of finding that they have the power to shake and pluck back that fleshly vestment, even as a wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion. Something about his choice of wording there is reminiscent of Edinburgh's neoclassical architecture, the Greek airs that Edinburgh put on in her Georgian pomp. Now, people often complain about movie adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde, that Hyde appears large and gorilla-like, almost like a Bigfoot or a werewolf, when Stevenson quite particularly describes him as being smaller, and Nabokov picks up on this and and uses it to argue that the better part of Jekyll/Hyde is good, hence the fact that Jekyll is taller than Hyde. The point I was going to raise, given that Jekyll also describes Hyde as something like a son, is he right about that? Hyde might be shorter, but does that mean that he is necessarily younger? Incidentally, since I brought up names, Nabokov ascribes a Scandinavian origin to Jekyll and Hyde. Hyde not meaning outer skin, but haven, like more like a hiding place, and Jekyll being a Danish word for icicle, which works really rather well with all of the imagery of melting and dissolution in the novel. Also worth remembering that Stevenson was a big fan of the Wars of the Roses. He wrote a novel for younger readers called The Black Arrow, which I did a podcast on a few years ago. And Jekyll and Hyde's first names are Henry and Edward. Of course, Henry VI was overthrown and probably murdered on the orders of Edward IV. And in Jekyll and Hyde, we also have a Richard floating around in the form of Enfield, a distant kinsman of the narrator, Mr. Utterson. But back to the Newtown-Old Town split. The point that I was reminded of talking about Ferguson and this initial movement north during the initial construction of the new town was that by the time Stevenson was born, a century or so later, in 1850, the expansion was still going on and had by this point spun round to the southern side of Edinburgh's old town, the old city, which Stevenson complains about in picturesque notes, saying, "Day by day, one new villa, one new object of offence is added to another. All around Newington and Morningside, the dismalest structures keep springing up like mushrooms." The point he repeatedly stresses is that these new buildings are ugly and unfit for purpose, a symptom of greed and vanity. Now, when Stevenson writes about the elites of Edinburgh's Enlightenment leaving the old town for the new, he really seems to castigate them as abandoning the poor of Edinburgh's old city. He recounts stories of catastrophic tenement collapses and of seeing downward travellers retreating to the old city like a wounded animal to the woods, he says. Men on the road to ruin, socially exiled from the new town and retreating to the squalor of the old. Now, there's something familiar about this when you think of Jekyll's discovery of Hyde, which he finds a novelty incredibly sweet. He says it is a solution to the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not innocent freedom of the soul. This is what I was going to try and get at in my introduction, a kind of comparison between Jekyll's discovery, this solution of the bonds of obligation, and the social abandonment of the poor in Edinburgh. Remember that while abandoned, the old town was also associated with prostitution and other forms of illicit debauchery. Stevenson himself was one who put on a costume and a moniker and snuck across the bridge from the new town to the old town in order to indulge. So I think you could interpret Jekyll's compartmentalization of his irreconcilable selves as mimicking Edinburgh's attempt to socially separate old and new, poor and elite, unwashed and enlightened, escaping the old way of living when, as Stevenson puts it, the beggar was ensconced in the judge's chimney. Of course, as the story goes on to show, this separation cannot be sustained. As Chesterton brilliantly put it, the real stab of the story is not in the discovery that the one man is two men, but that the two men are one man. Once Jekyll's experiment in pulling a curtain across his divided selves fails, there is something telling about his choice of words when he runs out of chemicals needed for his serum and he is reduced to begging like an addict, "For God's sake, find me some of the old."